Paul, welcome aboard to the show. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
As our audience knows, there's no prepared questions. I don't even know what I'm going to ask until I ask it. Um, Very happy to have you today. I want to hear your worst horror story. So, what was the trial by fire, anytime in your career, not necessarily with the current company, that kind of really gave you an appreciation for becoming a hardcore engineer, manager? I mean, you got a lot to talk about. Go anywhere you want.
Oh, it's a good one. It's with Octopus. So we went to exhibit at a conference that Microsoft was running, and we had our booth all set up and everything. And at this time, we were kind of the only company really in our space. We were fairly well known. And the night before the conference, Microsoft announced that they were, actually, I'll tell you. The night before the conference, we went to a restaurant and we ate octopus at the restaurant, right, with the team. Okay, and so this was the lesson. And so we went to then the event the next day, and Microsoft announced that they were sort of launching a new product that was a more direct competitor with what we were doing, that they were bringing the price down to what a lot of people would perceive as free. And then later that day, I found out they'd also poached someone that had worked for us. And so all three of those things kind of happened the day after we ate octopus at the restaurant, and we've never eaten it again.
What is the? Did you have any awkward interactions with Microsoft employees, executives?
Microsoft's a hard one. I think it's a comic that was floating around on the internet a while ago of like the different org structures, right? You've probably seen it. And the Microsoft one specifically is the sort of every team has a gun pointed at every other team within Microsoft. And it's really true. So it's really hard to kind of reason about or interact with Microsoft as a single thing. And you can sort of, I think in the early days, I did feel a frustration sort of at Microsoft generally for how they'd acted in the space. The more you sort of get to know them and interact with them and interact with customers, you realize everyone's just trying to help their customers, and we're trying to do the same. And that's been a more peaceful mindset I've found for dealing with them.
That's fair. Google has had a history. I don't know if they're doing this today, but they would basically bring startups into their kind of accelerator or interview them for their VC program, and then they'll just rip them off and build it themselves. So these big organizations that we all love to love or love to hate, wherever you stand, sometimes they play dirty. It's not always all fun and smiles and cuddly bears.
They can, but it's just a lot of people at the end of the day. Yeah. Their own goals and objectives and customers. Yeah,
that's fair. How did your team react to that? Like, what was the immediate like, holy shit, what are we gonna do?
I think so. What happened? Like, it was so strange. So after they made all these announcements, and we had our booth set up at the expo hall, and the customers kind of streamed out of the keynote, and they came to our booth and they said, "So what do you do that's different to what Microsoft does?" And we were thinking the Microsoft thing didn't exist 10 minutes ago, and everybody knew us, and it was amazing how quickly that had flipped. So I think that probably knocked us for a bit. I think one of the bits of advice we got actually from Redgate Software at the time. So Redgate had also been competing with Microsoft, and they had interactions where Microsoft had sort of directly built clones of their products and things. And one of the things they realized is that their failures, as they relayed it to us, had come about because in situations where they thought because Microsoft entered a space, they should give up on it. Like every time they'd done that, of course, the products had failed. The products where Microsoft or another large vendor entered the space and they just stuck it out and they focused on their customers and their product, those ones always worked. And so we kind of actually drew a lot of conviction and comfort around that. And so I think, we just focused on our customers, our product. And in some ways it did get easier. I think Microsoft entering the space kind of helped to legitimize it a little bit. And we could focus on just saying, well, we do it better rather than trying to educate people.
That's such an important point, right? So if there's no other competitors in your space, that's actually a detriment. So having a big monster come in, spend a whole lot of marketing dollars can be a wonderful thing. Because now your customer is educated by Microsoft, and now you can come and sweep in and say, well, we do a better job. Or do you want to kind of go for the behemoth that will never answer you or pick up your phone? So that's a really important point. Competition isn't always bad. I absolutely love that.
No, and the other thing I think you have to imagine is these companies, these large companies, they enter spaces for specific reasons, and they also get bored quickly. So, for us, we've spent 10 years kind of just focused on this one thing, and our customers appreciate that. Microsoft comes into it, they do some work for a few years, and then the product just plateaus and doesn't go anywhere.
Yeah.
And you can ride that out. Like if you're a startup, as long as you stay profitable, you can ride that out for as long as it takes.
Yeah. So what are the, oh my God, there's so many directions I want to go. What are the strategies to outperform a behemoth that just has seemingly no funding limits?
So like when we look back, I don't think them entering our space prevented our revenue from growing or anything like that in the way that you would assume that it would, right, when they enter it. But what it did do is it made us kind of refocus our strategy. So we sort of realized like basic deployments that we'd sort of built up around probably wasn't going to be a huge opportunity for us. The bottom of that would go out. At the same time, we had a lot of enterprise customers who, I would say, without it being our intent, they were kind of pulling us into the enterprise. So you'd get these bug reports of like, hey, I'm using your product and we've got 2,000 of these things. And you'd think like, I only designed it for 10. Like this was meant to be used by small teams and you're using it way bigger than we expected. And so, but we realized that would be a part of the market that Microsoft would probably never really set out to solve, because they had their own goal of entering, which was like, just help people get onto Azure, right? And start using Azure cloud consumption.
So I got to stop you here. This is incredibly important. And I got to tell you, a lot of really great companies that are doing well don't get the point that you're talking about now, which is really strategically having a focus on how to grow within the stack, right? Are they upstream? Are they downstream? Are they in the middle of the stream? And how does their strategies align with what is the exact persona that they're selling to? People kind of fish and kind of like, well, we'll sell to small, we'll sell to big. If somebody has a problem, we'll solve it. We'll do a product enhancement, like no problem.
Yeah.
But what you're describing here, which I think is absolutely wonderful, and I'm kind of reading between the lines, to keep me honest here, what you're describing in that you guys analyzed the Microsoft strategy, why they were doing it, how they were going to grow, who they were selling to, and then you just worked alongside them. And because the market was massive, then you both could grow and you weren't impeding each other. To me, that's brilliant strategy.
100%, yeah. And in some ways, look, it was probably the only option available to us as well. So
hey, other people have failed, even with that. Choosing the wrong option. Let's put it this way: there's a lot of wrong options, even if there's only one right one, right? So let's just put it safe.
Yeah, that's right.
But you're on the trade floor, right? And you've got a bunch of AEs, I'm assuming, and they're like, "Holy shit! What is our pitch? What do we say?" What did that meeting with yourself or this VP sales or CRO whatever be like? This is what we're gonna do.
So right now, like we're at about 80 million in revenue. We have a CRO. We have all of those folks. Back then, we were probably, I would say, about less than 10 million ARR, and we had the company was completely bootstrapped. We had 2 people that were developers that we sort of convinced to do a bit of marketing, and we had no salespeople. There was definitely no CRO.
We need to come back to that. What you just said.
Yeah. So the expo booth that we had was engineers. That's all. That's all we had. That's all we brought. I think maybe a support rep was with us, but that was it. So we just did our thing. Customers would come over and we would show them our product, and they would see, the specific value that the area that we were we felt like we were focused on the hardest part of the whole DevOps problem, and Microsoft was sort of trying to do a little bit of everything, but none of it in depth. And customers where deployment was the hardest thing of what they were doing, they found their way to us, and they still found value in the product. But yeah, was not the day that we expected it to be.
So yesterday I did another interview, and sometimes these horror stories are the ones that bring people together. It's the stories you remember years later, and they build relationships. So in many ways, when you're in the that shit moment, if you kind of think in a year or two, I'm going to appreciate this is going to be fun in retrospect. So there's that as well.
Yeah, and there's something about because it was such a big event, right? Because it was such a visceral moment where the whole world for us changed on that day. I think we then responded to it in a way that was like, okay, let's take this really seriously and do it. There's been other
Mm.
times where, there's like you could imagine if a smaller competitor entered the space, if it happened over a longer period of
Yeah.
time, you could sort of ignore them and not think, okay, I need to change my strategy. We need to
Yeah.
do something radically different. Yeah.
So it was so you're saying the slap in the face in some ways was a positive thing.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, in fact, it helped us. Like, I think we're a better business today because of it. And it's funny,
Mm.
like, people talk about like ideal customer profile and all of these
Yeah.
things. You expect those things to get broader over time, right? Like when the company's small, you have a very narrow ICP, and as it grows,
Yeah.
it's going to get bigger and bigger. There's all these people that join. For us, it's actually been the opposite. When we started, it
Oh.
was like, well, anyone who deploys stuff is a customer, and as it grows, it's like, no, people with
Oh, okay.
complex deployments
Okay.
are our customer, and people at enterprises are our customer, and
Yeah.
it's narrowed over time.
Yeah.
Interestingly,
Yeah. Well, I would argue that you're cheating there a little bit because I would argue that strategically you want to start with one narrow persona and then grow it so then it would grow over time. But if you're trying to fish and do a catch-all and you're kind of getting smart about, oh, well, my sales marketing actually needs to be more specific, that's when you kind of go from wide to narrow. So
yeah,
I think it's still fair to say that your personas should grow over time, but obviously not if you started from a
they
catch-all.
do. They do.
Um,
But
Let me
there's something
go
about
ahead.
just finish that thought. There's something about like I think as a market grows and becomes like a
Mm,
category becomes really
yeah.
established, like there's not just going to be one need for that market, right? So you take like
Yeah.
automobiles, there's lots of different needs that people have of automobiles. So lots of different companies can really focus on those needs. I think the failure would have probably been for us to kind of just focus on we just make cars,
Yeah.
we're not focusing on one specific type of car.
Right.
Yeah.
No, I appreciate that. So I want to go back to that moment of the AEs who are actually engineers, software engineers, like coding and stuff.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
so the AEs are kind of freaking out maybe, and I want to talk to the soft human management of that. Did you have a like these like light bulb leadership moments where you're like, okay, we're gonna do this? What did that look like?
I think on the day we tried to probably just assume everything would be okay. Let's do our things. As we
Mm,
I think talked on the flight home, I think definitely we started to think about what was next. And there was probably a period where we didn't rush a lot of this. Like what we didn't want to do is okay, something's changed.
yeah.
Let's have like a knee jerk reaction because I think at that time we might have concluded okay, let's just sort of find a way to orderly wind it down or something, right? Like let's just give
Yeah.
up. And I've definitely seen companies do that. Microsoft or somebody enters their space, they just assume it's a foregone conclusion, they won't win, and they abandon or they massively pivot, to make a new product or something. Um,
Yeah.
so actually taking a bit of time to talk to other companies, other CEOs around, what had worked for them and what hadn't, I think gave us a much more thoughtful approach for how we're going to handle it. Yeah.
That's an incredibly, I mean, what you're showing us here is an incredibly important skill, I think, and that's kind of being measured and slow and getting input and feedback. I do agree that there is an issue if you're in head of the steamroller, right? But I think that's only true if you are a feature within somebody's ecosystem. Then you're being asked to be run over. But if you are your own ecosystem and a competitor comes in, even if they have a lot of money, well, they're going to move slowly, and that's your huge, advantage right there.
Yep.
So I appreciate that comment. I want to do a small shift. So you're growing. You are over the years hiring hundreds of engineers and other types of sales, marketing.
Mm.
So your engineers are no longer doing BDR and SDR.
Yep.
What have you learned over the years when it comes to hiring? What is hiring sales engineers, software engineers, and account managers? It's all the same, or is this a whole different ballgame?
I think there is a lot of similarity from it. Like it's less different than you would think. I think with some roles it's a little bit easier. Like for example, I think hiring engineers can be quite easier in some ways because there's generally a fairly high bar. Like most engineers can code stuff. There's a fairly easy way to figure out who can do the role, who can't. There's a large part of it which is what's it going to be like when they join the team, like at the interpersonal level and stuff. That is probably common across all roles. But engineers, I would say, um, tending to be more introverted can be a little bit easier to read. Like it's a little bit easier to feel like, okay, if I've got this feeling from working with this person, that feeling will probably sustain as they join the company and grow. I think when you get into other types of roles like sales and marketing, I think actually that the hardest part was my own learning how to kind of think about those roles. And to give you like an analogy, I think I'm a software engineer by background. The first few versions of the product I built myself. So I think I would know that if I'm hiring an engineer, I'm looking for a .NET engineer, backend engineer, so much experience, all this stuff. I wouldn't accidentally hire a DBA or a Python data science person, right? And just assume all engineers are the same.
Yeah.
With marketing and sales, you kind of assume they are all the same, right? If you haven't run a marketing or sales team. And so quite a lot of fits and starts, I think, trying to figure out and learn, what these types of roles are and who's good. And then the challenge can be some of them can be more extroverted. And so just figuring out what it'll be like when they're really part of the team for the long term can be harder to read. I think there's definitely, I think both when hiring engineers and other roles, we probably tend to over-index on skills. And one of the things I think I got comfortable doing later was sort of just sitting with the idea of someone joining and getting that, because you sort of think like, if I'm hiring someone, it should be a totally logical decision. It should be like, they have the skills that I need, they can do the thing. The sense of like, you know what, I think if I was working with this person, I probably wouldn't look forward to coming into work the next morning. Like there's just something about it that would feel off. But you ignore that voice, right? Because it's supposed to be a logical hiring decision. I think that's a failure mode that applies across all roles. I think actually leaning into, no, like working with this person would energize me. It would bring kind of an amazing feeling to the team. And it's good that they also happen to have the technical skills that we need.
Yeah. I think this is a really sensitive topic. I'll tell you why. In certain areas, topics, and domains, there is a difference between engineers who just can't do the job at all, will completely mess with your code, and engineers who can do the job, okay, and then engineers who can do it 5 to 10 times better, meaning faster. So it's as if you've hired 3 or 4 engineers for the cost of 1.3 because you're going to pay them more. So there's that. But then on the other hand, when I hire, then I'll solve a problem together with them. And I want to see, that we can communicate, and then we can communicate well, kind of jive off each other, and that kind of accelerates. So on the one hand, I agree with you because I test for that. I test to see that we can communicate well. But on the other hand, I'm like, hold on. I've also hired like antisocial people that don't have those team playing skills because they were worth 4 or 5 people for the cost of 1.3, 1.4. How do you reconciliate those conflicts?
Yeah, the analogy I used recently talking to someone about this is like, there's 2 ways to kind of describe most jobs, right? Like there's a very factual, technical way to describe a job, and then there's a more kind of, what is the impact that the job has on the world? So like a great example would be, what does a doctor do? And there's 2 ways to answer it. One could be the high level mission-oriented outcome, which is they save lives, right? That's what a doctor does. But you could also describe it as a doctor has their hands in blood and guts and gross stuff, right? They're like human body mechanics or something. And that would also be a perfectly valid description of like what a doctor does. And the challenge, I think, is figuring out like which of those 2 things is the more meaningful thing sometimes. And so I think, if you were to say, like, what does an artist do? An artist, the high level description is like they make people kind of reconsider their perception of humanity or think differently about the world. At the low level, they scribble on paper, and so I think for software engineers, it's the same. Like there's a basic building block, which is like they write code. That's not the hard part. Writing code has never been the hard part in my experience.
I agree.
I think what the high level of what software engineers do is they solve problems, often by applying technology in the service of solving those problems, but often not. And the thing that I think you're really trying to figure out when you hire an engineer is there's a baseline of like, can I trust this person to be let loose on my code base and they won't make it worse,
Yes.
to your point. But then beyond that, are they going to be a great collaboration partner in the collective nature of solving problems? And if I can't bounce problems around, if we can't get that flow going of, back and forth conversational, exploring a problem and finding solutions for it, they're never going to be that 10x engineer you're talking about.
Yeah. No, I would agree with it. And I would almost argue that you can be both antisocial and kind of hard to get along with maybe socially, but also be very easy to talk about tech, solve problems, and jive. So when I see these posts on
Yeah,
LinkedIn, like, oh, being a team player is so much important, then I'm like, no, you don't have to be a team player. You need to have really great communication skills at the technical level and problem solving level and listen really and be creative about your thinking. But yeah, you sometimes you're going to be rough around the edges, and that's totally okay. So
yeah,
I think there's a really fine nuance there that these, LinkedIn voices that just totally miss. And sometimes I just want to say, nope, that's wrong.
yeah.
But I restrain myself.
Do you think this is true, or have you had this experience? I think a big part of actually what helps to work well with someone is this shared sense of they are here for the same reason I am,
Yeah.
to solve the same problem, and
Yeah.
therefore I trust them, no matter how directly they speak to me, no matter how,
Yeah.
like, there's uh, they care about the problem versus like caring
Yes.
about themselves, their career, being right all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that engineers are more kind of honest and direct and non-sugar-coated than other, kind of positions and roles. And I think that many times they do care deeply. And if they stop caring deeply, then they just fall apart. Like they can't do the job anymore. Um, in some ways, I think that's the beauty of these kind of hardcore engineers. In other ways, it makes it harder for other people to interact with them, I think, because they will give you the unvarnished truth. And my chief product officer just told me the other day that, oh, I need to talk to you. I'd like you to give me the unvarnished truth. So some people will appreciate it and they'll kind of see it as an upside and a skill. I can also sugarcoat, but yeah, it's part of who we are. And I started off as a hardcore engineer, so I still have those, to a certain degree. When I don't suppress them, I have those characteristics. Totally suppressed when I talk to customers, obviously. That's a
yep,
different game. Um, so this is delightful. I really appreciate these insights. I want to talk about not the hiring process, but the kind of culture that works best with engineers to make sure that they are, from a really kind of business perspective, the most productive that they can be and not getting demoralized, but then kind of really enjoying what they're doing and kind of feeling like, yeah, this is fun. I want to keep doing this from a perspective of, this is a great team and culture. What are the biggest mistakes and what are the best practices to make that happen?
yeah. I think we've pendulum swinged a little bit over time, and it's probably worth exploring like the extremes of that, and then kind of where we've landed. Um, in the early days, so the first probably 3 or 4 years, I kind of just wrote all the code and answered all the support tickets and everything myself. And then we started hiring engineers, um, and we sort of grew a team. We probably got to about 20, 30 engineers at that point. And actually, I was fairly convinced we would never need management. Like we were going to build a 100-person company without any management, because my experiences as an engineer with management is they didn't seem to add a whole lot of value, so I didn't want any in the company. And then what happened
Hmm.
is I just became the
I,
manager
I
of
I
everybody.
believe that too, and then I became a manager.
Yeah, actually, I think managers are very, very important people to have around. But like any job, it can be done well or badly. I
Yes.
think so. So one of the challenges, right, is you hire these really smart people that you're paying a lot of money to, and you're hiring them not because they can type code, but because they should be collaborative partners in solving a problem. And so I think there's always this balance between how much autonomy do you want to give them to be able to sort of find the problem, define it, come up with a solution and solve it, versus how aligned do you want all of them to be as they all collectively work together on stuff. And so we had years where I think we had a fairly top-down sense of what we wanted to build, but it didn't create a lot of room for engineers to
Mm,
actually really fully take ownership of the area they were working on. We had other times where engineers would just sort of ship a feature that after it shipped, you'd look at it and think, how did we come up with
mm,
that? And no one ever used the feature. And others where they would do that and people would use the feature a lot. Um, and so and the challenging thing I think with engineering, it's funny because you think compared to like sales and marketing, you assume engineering is like the hard science thing,
yeah.
and sales and marketing is like this fluffy thing. But
Yeah.
actually, like when you manage a sales and marketing team, you're very much managing it towards like things that are
Revenue.
measurable and things that you
Yeah.
can set goals around. Engineering is so hard to do that, right? Because it's so hard to estimate engineering projects. And so a lot of how you're managing it is like communication and then just sort of hoping that we're making as best progress as we possibly can.
Yeah.
And so we've kind of tried a lot of things. I think where we've ended up now, and I think it's probably for now at least the ideal place, is having long-lived teams. What we tried to do for a while is every time a new idea would come up, we would just move people around. But that it takes a really long time for people to get used to working together.
Yeah.
So you have long-lived teams that work together for over many years, and you bring missions to them. And you do have to really lean in and define the mission and the scope around it. Like, our job is to build the best way of delivering software to Kubernetes from the moment we deploy something through to like we can see it in production. So you can't be fluffy about it. You have to be somewhat defined about it. Then you have to sort of get out of the way and let them figure out what that means. And then at some point, and this is the trick, you have to sort of time when you get involved again, just to check, did they really get the mission? And quite often they have got it in a way that is more deeply than I have, because I have some perception about this thing, but they've really explored it. And so it's really delightful when you sit down with them and they sort of unpack what they've learned and what they're planning to do. And you think, oh, wait, you've got this. Like, I'm getting out of the way. And there's others where you think, no, I didn't. I got to bump this a little bit left to the right to make it align with what I'm thinking. But then there's a lot of getting out of the way and creating that autonomy for them. Yeah.
I think there's something brilliant in that insight. And there's definitely, as an engineer, where I was doing everything, right? I was doing the executive, the product management, then coding. I did feel in myself even that huge transition from kind of PMing it and kind of understanding the scope, the feature, why we're doing it, the business case, and then actually writing it. Suddenly, when you have to bring pen to paper or code to whatever Visual Studios, your brain changes phase and it clicks in a different way. So now you're thinking in a different pattern. So that's a very valuable insight. And I've actually never heard anybody talk about this hard versus soft and other way. I think that's beautiful. It's almost poetic. I really appreciate that you shared that with us. When you look about the things that can go wrong, what was the kind of nightmare horror story with maybe one of your engineers or one of your projects?
Can I give you a marketing one, actually? Because I think it's a bit more, and I think it applies actually very much to software engineering, but it's
let's go there.
Story. So over the years, we tried to build out our marketing team. And you can imagine that marketing to DevOps engineers is a particularly hard thing. One, because they don't really spend a lot of time. They have ad blockers on and they don't really tend to read a lot of marketing, and they tend to read through it pretty easily. And two, because it's really hard to find marketers who understand that persona and can market to them, right? And so we've had a few attempts at making this really work. But I think there was a particular time where we'd really grown the marketing team. It was about 20 people. And the way I think this is like a huge lesson for sort of where management can help, and also where I think in some ways management is often the problem, is we would do like a quarterly, you'd see like the quarterly plan for the marketing team. And it would be, every single marketer has a slide of their own. And on that slide is 4 KPIs that marketer has signed up to. And, all these initiatives they're going to do, right? This sort of almost trying to outcompete each other in all the stuff that they were individually going to commit to doing. And that was sort of the environment that had been created. And you looked at it in just complete disbelief. Like, there is no way that the designer's KPIs are to do these things, and your KPI is to publish a case study. And I know to get a case study out, you're going to need a designer to put it into a PDF, but that's not on their list. And you just look at this and it's stuff that I think engineering managers probably pick up a little bit better, right? The dependencies between things. But I think there's a massive role to be played by managers. Like, if you really think like what is it that a manager does, I think a huge part of it is just creating clarity for the team so that they can focus on the one thing that matters. Because from my point of view as CEO, I'm looking at this whole deck and I'm thinking, there is only one thing I need marketing to do. We're launching a feature.
Leads. Everyone
should be focused on this, drive leads, and everything else is optional. And you don't need, all you're doing is going to disappoint yourselves and each other, and the team isn't going to work. And so this was one where I think rebuilding that ended up being quite drastic things we had to do and a lot of changes to make. Yeah. But I think it applies. You see it in software teams too. I think managers oversubscribe people to KPIs, to goals. They don't give them clarity, and you end up with everybody ends the day feeling like they failed because they were supposed to do 10 things and they can't possibly do 10 things.
This is such an important point. I mean, the book that I'm writing, although it's called, the book, the name I wanted to give it was the Hidden Art of Middle Management. I ended up calling it something else with my publisher, but the reason for that is because I think that middle managers, especially in larger companies, right? Once you cross the 200-300 people threshold, they become indispensable, and a bad middle manager will destroy culture, will destroy morale. A VP can do that too. It's a little harder. They'll do that with their direct reports for sure. But middle managers can just either uplift the culture and they can just destroy it. And there really isn't that much culture coming top bottom. A lot of it is proxied by the middle managers. And I think many people don't understand that point, that a middle manager has that space to create their own culture in their team and then across teams as well. And then what's also incredibly interesting is that the relationships between the different middle managers completely changes the company, right? So if you're fighting and you're KPIing, and then here I do blame upper management, because if the incentive design for the different middle management is putting them against each other, then that's a recipe for disaster. And I'll tell you, my organization, Siemens did some really bad mistakes there. So I think this is something we just don't talk about enough. So I want to dive into this topic. When you think about middle management, how do you see, as the CEO, your role to interact with them, guide with them, but then also get feedback and measure them?
It's a really great question. There's a book. I'm really struggling to remember the name, but I know that it kind of went into some thoughts on this that I think are like a nice anchoring point. The idea is, like, if you take sort of 4 groups of people, right? The sort of the engineer who's writing the code, the middle manager, the executive that's kind of setting direction, and then the customer using the thing. The observation in the book, I wish I could remember the name, is that every one of those has a default position that they just automatically fall into, right? So the customer's default position is like, why don't they ever ask me anything? They're too busy talking amongst themselves. They never ask me. And the executive's default position is, I'm taking on all this responsibility and I just wish people would, do the thing I'm asking them to do. The engineer's default responsibility is, management doesn't know what it's doing. I'm getting conflicting directions. They're not even letting me talk to the customer to understand what the customer wants. The strategy makes no sense. And the middle manager's default position, I think, is this, the way the book describes it, is this sort of position of like frustration at being stuck in the middle of those two things.
It's the guy tied to 4 horses by their limbs, and the horses are going, like the Middle Ages, basically torture. I'll tell you, that's what I felt like in, as a middle manager in Mentor Graphics, which turned into Siemens. That's how I felt, and it required for me to really learn and grow skills in order to navigate that.
So I think there is a part of it which is like, the job of leadership is to set the high level goals and align everyone around what we're trying to do. And so it is really important, I think, for leadership to try and understand, like, how well is that translating throughout the organization? Like, does everyone kind of really get it? I think the best way to kind of shortcut everything is to go and just talk to engineers. And so when we do like a company get together, I have this sort of Rolodex in my mind of like all the people at the company. I'm here for 3 days. My goal is to have a conversation with every one of them, and to try and just in that conversation figure out, like, get to know them a little bit, because that's always really nice, and also try and figure out how well is like what I'm trying to accomplish really translating at all levels of the org, and to try and then debug when it's not. I think the middle manager, the challenge can be, I think they have 2 challenges. So there's this sense that they're stuck in the middle of everything, right? They don't get to set the strategy, though they have some input on it. And they sort of listen to the team being frustrated, but they can't really change it. I think there's another challenge they have that's a little bit unique. If you think of the engineer is part of a team. So they have a team that they belong to. At the executive level, we have an executive team, and we spend a lot of time with each other, many, many hours a week. And so we're really in lockstep. And if you were to ask the head of revenue, who's their team, it's the executive team first. and then secondly, his revenue team. The middle manager, I think the challenge is they're often not really part of a team that encompasses the whole of middle management. So you might have a couple of engineering managers and they feel like they're a part of the team because they sort of meet with the head of engineering, but they're not meeting with one of the area sales managers. They're not meeting with someone who owns a part of marketing. But I think they often have the same problems.
Mm.
And then because they're in this position where they kind of have to aggregate a lot of stuff and sort of push up and kind of represent the needs of their teams, in some ways, I think it can make getting clarity on what the issue is a little bit harder. And so I think one of the superpowers actually that middle managers have, I think first is to really move outside and talk to all of the other middle managers in the org to really figure out where the common problems are. And that can build real consensus around how to solve it. And then I think the other part is to not feel like they have to be in the middle of all of those conversations, but actually say like, hey, Paul, when you have 5 minutes, you should talk to this engineer because they'll give you some really, ground truth experience on this problem. And, all of us agree this is the problem, but instead of us trying to solve it, we want you to hear it directly from this engineer. I think that's a massive thing they can do that makes a big difference.
That's brilliant. I mean, there's a few other points there that you mentioned that are very important that I want to touch upon, but this is really, really brilliant because I'll tell you a short story. In Siemens, the sales managers were basically cursing my boss and my team. So, and now, and multiple managers, different directions. So I am like cursing, like feeling violently abused. And I was like, I like, this is bad. And I don't even know what's wrong. And it almost seems like through their comments that it's just all over the place. And, I don't want to tell the long story, but the solution was exactly what you are talking about here. It was actually me that was at fault. I needed to build the relationship with those middle managers. I needed to understand their incentive design. I needed to change my language to reflect their KPIs, their needs, their wants. And in sales, it's very clear, it's revenue. And the real problem why they were upset with me is debookings and revenue recognition delays, those kind of things. And then I needed to go and communicate to my team how sales and marketing were thinking and why these executives were upset with us. And I think that shift, which is exactly what you're describing, was the solution. So this is absolutely brilliant, right? Middle managers building relationships with other teams, not necessarily inside of their own kind of vertical of engineering, but beyond. It can just change the trajectory of a company. It's so important.
Yeah.
I want to change step for a sec. There is a problem that I've noticed that you have managers that are absolutely brilliant, but they're not great communicators in regards to they're not political. And then you've got managers who are maybe not brilliant and not doing the best thing, or maybe self-centered or political, but they're amazing communicators. Which means is they're highly influential and they can kind of negotiate you into a corner. And you're like, what just happened here? Now I'm touching my face because I'm recalling one of these people who happened to be, I won't say what my relationship to him was, but it felt unfair. It felt bad for the organization that somebody who can out-communicate you but is not making the right decisions for the right reasons. How do you manage that? Have you come across that situation? Do you have kind of a culture to mitigate that?
We've definitely had that. And I think when it's happened in the past, what tends to happen is those people, unfortunately, they do tend to get a fairly long leash. And part of that, I think, is I will often tend to convince myself that, I can figure out how to get the best out of this person, right? Because we've hired them because they've brought some skills. At some point, you sort of, and I'll talk about what I think the failure mode is and why it doesn't work from what we've seen. But what I think has happened as we've gone through a lot of these experiences, and then you go and talk to like the engineering managers who work for those people or whatever, is like they could all kind of see it. Like the signs were kind of there. Everyone got it. When the person left, everyone had sort of breath. There was this breath of, everyone was glad
Relief.
that the situation had changed. And so then I think what happens is the company kind of builds a little bit of an immune system as long as you keep up that communication. So I think the worst thing is like you hire a manager or something and you sort of give them a team and then just sort of don't actually check in with the team. And I've definitely had it where I haven't taken the time to really get to know all the people on the team.
Yeah.
And then I've kind of taken the word of, the person in the middle, that, everyone on the team is bad, or, whatever the kind of narrative is. And you only really break that down by just going and building relationships with the team first. And so you have to have that across the company as much as you can. I think, you said the word political. And I think what I've seen is that the company works best when every conversation we're having is not about you or me, but it's about the customer
Thank you.
or the company, right?
Thank you.
So like if you and I are talking about, well, my team needs this and your team needs that, that's the wrong conversation. The right conversation is, for the company to be successful, we need to do this. And frankly, if you and I can't figure out how to do that, then the company deserves two people who can figure out how to do that, because the needs of the company outweigh the needs of the team.
I would agree with that, but I think it's a little oversimplified. I'll tell you why. If you're such a good communicator, you're going to speak that language, and you're going to out-communicate the other person through the language of the customer, etc. But really what you're thinking is, oh, I need my revenue recognition, or I need my revenue targets, or I need my, my extra reports and my headcount, because the company's policy is that it makes me a manager of this level when I have this much of reports. So I need to grow. So they're thinking about all these, internal incentive. They're speaking the language of external customer centric. And then reconciling that is incredibly difficult, but you already gave us the answer. And it's what you said about, crossing that loop, listening to the ground, and seeing if there's any misalignments. Really, really important. So I think that's the right answer. I completely agree with it. I don't see it happening as much. I see a lot of executive level management completely disconnected from the 2 tiers of management beneath them, and then completely disconnected from the ICs and individual contributors. And it creates a situation where these toxic managers, is what I'm going to call them, are just lying to the senior executives through their teeth. And in fact, the great signal to this is if you get slapped in the face as an IC or a junior manager for talking to a senior manager by that VP, that's because they don't want you fucking, excuse my language,
that's right,
their narrative.
The narrative is
breaking down. That, yes, that they don't want the truth getting up there. I'll tell you, I see less of that in software, because I think in software we have better managerial practices. I think we have better managerial cultures. I see it a lot in pharma. I see it a lot in other industries where it seems to be that there's higher churn, there's less culture like we have. We've borrowed a lot of our culture from manufacturing. We've really gotten good over the years, I think. But this is not the truth in other industries. So it's really interesting when I kind of hear those stories from my extended friends and family.
I think that the skip level relationships are a really important way to find these things. I think there's something about, you're familiar with like the sort of compass that every manager has, right? Like the north is like reporting to their boss, right? The south is their team, and then east to west is like other people and external customers and so on. The problem, I think, is like, unless you take deliberate steps to get to know the people who are sort of south of the people you're managing, you'll be completely oblivious to it. And it's hard because you are, like for me, although I kind of run the whole company, honestly, there's only really like 4 or 5 things that are going to make a big difference in decisions I make this year. So there's only going to be 4 or 5 things I'm really leaning into and working with people on. And there's a whole lot of stuff I just have to trust people are doing the right thing. But it's the only way to find them.
Paul, you are way over time because we've had so much fun. We usually do not go 43 minutes. So I got to tell you, this has been wonderful. Come back into the picture a little bit because you've been drifting there to the left. There we go. Okay. So really hard question. It's the only scripted question that we have in the show, but it's difficult because it's personal. If you had to go back to 20-something-year-old Paul, what would you advise him?
I think it would probably be something along the lines of to take some of these leaps, right? Like there's times in life where you have opportunities to do something that's a bit scary, right? Like life kind of calls on you to do something that you're a bit uncomfortable with. Every time I've just kind of done one of those things, it's worked out. And so to just sort of do more of them, like just take on more of them and do more things, I think would probably be the big one. And just back yourself as much as you can. Especially, this is the problem when you start hiring experts on things, right? That's when everything goes south, because you stop listening to your own feeling on how stuff should work. You start listening to experts, and it takes many years to realize you need to listen to experts, but you also have to listen to yourself at the same time.
Paul, thank you so much for joining today. This has been an absolute delight.
You too. Thank you for having me.